Recent hurricanes have devastated parts of the southeastern United States, and even though the tri-state is over 600 miles away from the ocean, the impacts of these storms can still be felt right here at home. We'll explore some of the local impacts of hurricanes. That's next on WNIN Newsmakers. Welcome, I'm Noah Alatza, the Chief Communications Officer at the University of Evansville. Aside from the obvious weather implications, one of the ways that hurricanes can affect people is disruptions to the supply chain. When Helene caused catastrophic flooding in Asheville, North Carolina, it interrupted the manufacturing of IV fluids, and now hospitals across the country are assessing their use of IV fluids and are even rationing in some cases. Locally, our two hospital systems have released statements regarding the shortages. Ascension St. Vincent says that there has been minimal impact to our hospitals related to the Baxter plant outage, while Deaconess says our skilled staff and providers are trained to handle these challenges and continue to provide the highest level of patient care with no disruptions at this time. It is expected to be several weeks before that supply is replenished. Our first guest is Beth Sweeney, Executive Director of the Southwest Indiana chapter of the Red Cross. Thank you so much for being here, Beth. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So first and foremost, we're following the aftermath now, nearly a month after Hurricane Helene struck several states across the southeastern United States. And curious, back here at home, what does the Red Cross do during natural disasters, just even at a very broad level? Particularly in light of some of that damage we saw across Florida and particularly in North Carolina?
Well, folks right here at home, our volunteers with the Southwest chapter do support those efforts all across the country. So we have deployed several volunteers from our area to go down to several of those states from Hurricane Helene and also Hurricane Milton to support, working in shelters, doing mobile feeding, doing disaster assessment, providing health services and mental health services. So we deploy people for about 2 weeks at a time to go and support efforts there. And then we have other volunteers and staff members who are supporting efforts back home.
Now, how often do you run into certain disasters? And I know every year is different, but on an annual basis, how often are you deploying those resources and those assets?
Well, we're deploying them a lot more often than we were, say, a decade ago. I do know that Red Cross is responding to quite a few more disasters than we were 10 years ago. We know that those billion-dollar disasters have increased by 85% in that same time period. So we're deploying people more frequently because these disasters are happening more often, they are more catastrophic, and people are being displaced for longer periods of time.
And Beth, we see the images coming out, heartbreaking images from North Carolina and from Florida following Helene and Milton. How does that impact us right here, though, locally, from your vantage point? We're talking about the needs for services, right, in those affected regions. How does that really make an impact locally for our Red Cross chapter right here in the tri-state?
Well, we're doing everything we can to support the efforts there while maintaining what we need to here. So we are raising funds to ensure that we are supporting families in those areas to help pay for relief supplies. We have provided 2.3 million meals since Helene hit. So for both Helene and Milton, we have distributed, I believe it's 138,000 supplies for people. So these are things like, equipment, fuel, camp stoves, generators, those types of things as well. So raising money to support those efforts, that's something we're doing back home, raising awareness of what is happening and the support that we need. 90% of the Red Cross workforce is volunteers. So we're doing our best to recruit new volunteers that either have the time to deploy and help those affected areas or help with services back home. So the average home fire, a multi-family fire, if we had a tornado here and people were displaced, a major power outage, those types of things.
You previously mentioned that these volunteers go on kind of the 2-week trips down there, but we're talking about long-term here, years potentially of rebuilding. Is there a long-term strategy there when it comes to the work that the Red Cross does in those affected areas?
So when a disaster happens, or as we're anticipating it, for example, for Helene and Milton, we sent down supplies. We had evacuation shelters open. We deployed volunteers ahead of time. So we're working on that. Then once the storm hits, we're doing what we call mass care, which is making sure that people have shelter, they have food, they have health services that they need. Then our teams, which are doing this now, are going out door to door, working with emergency managers, doing disaster assessments on homes. Those families will receive financial assistance to help them get through those, first few weeks. And we connect them with a caseworker to work on a recovery plan. So that's connecting them to other resources and other community partners. This is going to be long-term recovery. Some of those financial donations that people are making to support these relief efforts will also go to supplement that initial financial assistance that we provide. So some of these families we know are going to need additional financial resources, which we will continue to support along with other partner organizations.
Beth, I know you mentioned a little bit earlier some of the needs that are there right now. Are there some of the greatest needs that you could mention if people are looking to still donate or want to help out in recovery?
Sure. If people would like to help, of course, financial donations allow us to be able to provide the care that we're providing, that direct financial assistance, and eventually possibly long-term assistance down the road. Other things they can do is reach out, call 1-800-RED CROSS if you're interested in volunteering. If you want to become a shelter worker, we can get you trained pretty quickly and you can deploy pretty quickly. We also encourage people to give blood. Initially, when those hurricanes hit, we had to cancel 2,100 blood drives in those impacted areas. Blood has a shelf life of 42 days, so we always have to be collecting blood and recruiting donors. And that blood, while it supports hospitals here, it also goes where it's needed most. So if we can help restock the shelves here, that will make a big impact in the Southeast.
And it's something a lot of people don't think about oftentimes is the blood shortage that comes along following these natural disasters. Beth, I'm curious too, we're seeing a lot locally, these drives for donations that different, nonprofit organizations across the tri-state might be doing. Just some best practices when people are looking to support these victims of natural disasters. Are there any best practices you can give them to look for when they want to make that donation?
Well, I can tell you my phone has rung off the hook since the storm happened with so many generous people in our community asking, how can we help? What can we do? We do get a lot of requests, people wanting to send those in-kind donations like clothing, bottles of water, pallets of supplies, those types of things. We do take some of that, but it's kind of on a larger scale. So people that are really wanting to help, we encourage them to make sure that they're talking to an organization that's on the ground there, that they know if they are raising these donations, if they're collecting these donations like clothing or whatever it is, that it does have a designated place to go, and that is a need that has been requested from one of those communities. So we're just encouraging people to make sure they're making those calls and checking and making sure they have a plan in place for where it's going to go and who it's going to help.
Great insights. We know the recovery is a long road ahead, and we appreciate all of the work that you do, Beth, with the Red Cross. Beth Sweeney, the Executive Director of the Southwest Indiana Chapter of the American Red Cross, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now here to talk about the direct weather impact of hurricanes on the tri-state is Jeff Lyons. He's the Chief Meteorologist for WFIE 14 News. Jeff, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you making time.
Thanks for having me, Noah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So after Helene hit Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, it ended up right here in the tri-state, as we are all well aware, with, I believe, several inches of rain during that time period. Talk about the local impact that had, though, right here in the tri-state as Helene came toward us.
Well, when compared with how it affected the rest of the country, eastern North Carolina, Tennessee, and the like, and of course Florida, Georgia, and on down, we got off pretty easily. We needed the rain. We had, I believe, between 4 and 5 inches. Now, the official measure was around 4 at Evansville Regional Airport, but there were spots that picked up quite a bit more, and that's real common with a hurricane situation. You get a steep gradient, kind of like snowfalls around here, and one spot gets hammered and the other one gets very little. We were already in the midst of a drought, and so we were waiting for rain. The beneficial part of it was a steady, slow rain. We had no severe weather, and it soaked in. So that's perfect. The other impact in the tri-state, like I said, we didn't have wind, nor did we have severe weather, there was a great fear that we would, because just a couple months before in July, when Hurricane Beryl came ashore in the Gulf, it spun up tornadoes, and we had our first EF3 in Mount Vernon ever in July. That's really, really uncommon. In fact, since the tornado record began in 1950, we'd only had 12 tornadoes ever, and most of them were EF0 or 1. So to have a day where you had 7 tornadoes, one of which was an EF3, was really just a head scratcher for all of us, that it would be that powerful so far away from the Gulf.
Right, and in the dead center of summer, right? I mean, it is very fascinating.
July's when we all take our vacations because nothing happens in July. And here we had probably the biggest event ever in July, tornado event, and it happened on the 10th.
And we talked to those Posey County first responders following that tornado there back on a previous episode of Newsmakers, so our viewers at home will be sure to tune into that. Back, though, to Hurricane Helene, Jeff, and I'm curious, how does that disrupt the prevailing westerly winds? You know, we commonly associate with the cold front moving from west to east.
Yeah.
How did that disrupt or shake things up?
Well, I'll answer that by citing another hurricane. So when we had Milton, which came across Florida, you'll note we had no impact here. And that's because we had high pressure anchored right over essentially the Midwest and the Great Lakes, a blocking high pressure. So it deflected it, and therefore it stayed down in Florida. The difference was with Helene and with Beryl was we didn't have that high pressure, nor did we have strong enough prevailing winds. And the storms were still strong enough when they came in, they disrupted that flow. And so now we're stuck with heavy rainfall. And it's kind of a coin toss. You know, you'll get some tropical systems that look like they're going to get up here and bring rain, and they don't have the mojo to continue, and they stop. Others, you know, come in here guns blazing. A good example is, for people old enough to remember, was Hurricane Ike in 2008, which occurred, I believe, in September here. And that thing, not only did it produce heavy rainfall, it was like widespread 70-mile-an-hour winds. It was one of the most damaging tropical systems from a wind standpoint that we had seen here in many years. So whether it disrupts the existing pattern is always up for debate, you know, whether it will be able to or not. And in the case of Helene, it was enough to overcome what little high pressure we had and to get that rain in here.
I'm curious, how often do hurricanes, tropical systems impact the tri-state region? Just on an annual basis over the past 5-10 years, how often are we seeing this?
A lot more often than you would think. Typically, the scenario goes like this. You'll have a tropical system in the Gulf, and it makes landfall, and that, because of the friction of the land, it will slow it down, and it rains a lot there. And then, depending on your prevailing pattern, if the southerly wind can continue, it will convey the rain here into the tri-state. And typically, because late summer is our dry period anyway, August, September, October are the dry months, we rely on tropical systems to break droughts and to, you know, give that last burst of rain to the farmers. So it does happen frequently. It's not a one-off or a strange. What is one-off and strange is when you would get higher end impacts from a tropical system, because, you know, we're 800, 700 miles, I guess 500 from the coast, short ways. Usually that's enough to kind of mitigate the severe threat.
And in your time here, I know you've been on tri-state television for decades, Jeff. Have you seen this increasing, decreasing, or about the same, even in your time here?
I would have to say it has increased in the number of storms that have made it all the way up and produced rain, you know, meaningful, widespread soaking rainfall. Disruptive weather like severe storms, tornadoes, flooding, it's kind of a wash. I mean, I would say in 36 years forecasting here, yeah, perhaps a few more in the last 10 to 15 years. The weather in general in the last 20 years, since about 2000, has become much more variable. We've had these kind of one-off events, you know, 500-year event kind of things around the country, not just here in the tri-state. And I attribute that to a warmer climate. The climate is warming. You can look at the temperatures from around the nation and the world. And because there's more heat, more energy in the atmosphere, more moisture, then you're prone to either drought, big high-end flood events, and severe weather.
What are some of the weather impacts that people might not often associate with hurricanes coming into us, or the remnants of hurricanes coming into the tri-state. What are some of those additional impacts that people might not think about?
Well, I think in the case of a tropical system, one scenario I saw, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the year, but it's been within the last 35, right? We had a hurricane that came up the East Coast, essentially, like the mid-East Coast, and it put torrential rain down up the Ohio River, up the watershed. Didn't rain a whole lot here. Farmers were in the middle of the growing season. It was August, and we flooded. We had, as my farmer friend calls it, a big river, and he farms down in the Union Township bottoms, and they had to open a floodgate to relieve pressure on a levee, and therefore lost their crop to that. And you're not expecting river flooding, certainly not in August. I mean, it never, not never, but it rarely happens. So that would be one really unanticipated outcome, that it would all come down the pipe, so to speak, and cause disruption here.
All right, well, Jeff, your expertise is always appreciated. Thank you so much for making time. Jeff Lyons, the Chief Meteorologist of WFIE 14 News. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now joining us is Lori Miller from the Vanderburg Humane Society and Rachel Allen from the Warwick Humane Society, and a special guest as well. We have Blinky here, the little cat. He came all the way from Florida, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. First question for both of you, Lori and Rachel. We know that in times of disaster, right, often we don't think about the animals that are also impacted when it comes to certain natural disasters. So why do animals get moved around from region to region? Let's just start there. When there is a hurricane, we're talking about Hurricane Helene and the impacts that it did to Florida, particularly Georgia and North Carolina. So the question is, how do animals get moved from region to region during a natural disaster? And maybe we start with you, Lori.
Sure. So Best Friends Animal Society is the one who mobilized this particular transfer. But really, disaster management, animal welfare has changed a lot. I actually was in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where a lot of people never saw their pets again. Shelters were already inundated with animals, which they are currently nationwide. It's a crisis. So they didn't really know what to do with the displaced animals, so they just took them and moved them to anywhere they could locally. But yeah, a lot of owners and their pets weren't reunited again. Now, great organizations like Best Friends, like I said, they help communicate with different shelters across the country, see who has space, and takes the animals that were already placed in the shelters down in the disaster area and get them out of there to make room for animals waiting to be reunited.
Rachel, can you tell us a little bit about Blinky here? And do we know any of his backstory?
So he's about 3 months old. He was found as a stray in Florida. So he came in on an airplane with a lot of other animals from Florida that us and both Vanderburg Humane Society were able to take so that they have room for animals that are going to be displaced, that were displaced during the hurricane.
I was going to ask too, how do animals hold up, right, during travel? Cats, dogs?
They did really good. Yeah.
We were surprised right off of the plane. Their tails are just shaking their crates because they're wagging so hard, and tippy-tappy, as I call it. And I mean, they were all in great spirits.
Yep, very excited.
I was shocked. And they kept a clean kennel on the way, which is also several hours of travel. So it just reminds us how resilient animals are.
How are they doing today?
Our animals are doing great. We have actually already adopted a couple of them out. And so they're adjusting fairly well. Some of them are still a little nervous, but I think they're adjusting really well.
Yeah, we took in 21 dogs, 16 cats, not up for adoption yet. We're just giving them time to decompress, putting them in play groups, helping them, feel somewhat normal in this new setting. So they're all so sweet. It's amazing.
If people want to help either of your organizations out, how can they do so? And Rachel, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, well, we are actually, almost all of our animals that were in our care before we took these hurricane dogs and cats are in foster homes now. So we were able to clear out our shelter to make room for them. So we're always welcoming more fosters to help us make space to help as many as we can. And then, any donating, we have a lot of events coming up. Anything to help would be amazing.
Yeah. And we held a big adoption event the week before when we were anticipating these pets. We had over 200 animals adopted the week before. We still have almost 700 in our care, but the best thing that the public can do is adopt, foster, volunteer, donate. If you can't do any of those things, really just spreading the word helps a lot.
You said 700 in your care. I'm just curious for viewers at home too, how many traditionally are in your care?
It's been staying between 500 and 700,
Wow.
really within the last several years. So we stay full.
And I know we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious too on the overall process, because you think about getting these animals right from these disaster zones hundreds of miles up here into the tri-state and what that process looks like even from a very high level. What does that look like when you're moving from shelter to shelter? And I know you mentioned this organization a little bit earlier, but if maybe we could just speak more to the kind of process of getting them here and what that looks like.
So, like I said, Best Friends, they're the ones who really mobilize the whole thing and are in contact with different shelters. And then there was another organization that actually flies animals out of disaster areas, and that's all they do. So they were brought into the mix, and they loaded them up in Tampa, brought them to Evansville. We were talking about it before we came on, how cool it was. Warwick and Vanderburgh got to link up and, team up on getting those animals off of the conveyor belt, off of the plane. But it takes a lot of people across many states at different levels to make this happen.
Sure. And we're so happy that even Blanky right here is doing well, and then it sounds like all of the other animals are doing well also. So thank you both for all of the work that you do for the animals, not only in our community, but also in these disaster zones as well. So Lori Miller from the Vanderburgh Humane Society and Rachel Allen from the Warwick Humane Society, thank you both for making time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks to our guest for joining us to learn more about the effects that hurricanes can have here locally. I'm Noah Alatza, Chief Communications Officer at the University of Evansville. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.